From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom. I'm your tour guide, Ken. Okay, folks, let's get this bus loaded up quickly because we got a lot of ground to cover. As we promised, this is going to be the most unusual tour bus ride you've ever had. Everybody up there seated, all the seatbelts on the upper deck? Okay, well, here we are, starting out at Navy Pier, of course, Illinois' premier tourist attraction with our brand new 196-foot high Ferris wheel. Did you know the first one ever was built here in 1893? This wheel was largely built with what we call tax increment financing, which involves using money that would ordinarily have been used for schools and parks. You know what? I really don't understand it, but it's a pretty cool wheel, isn't it? All right, let's get moving, shall we? We're turning south on Columbus Drive now, which is world famous as the site of Lollapalooza. And then over to our left, that's the Field Museum. They got a bunch of really cool new dinosaurs in there, and there are a bunch of other museums over there too. Now, down here, this is Roosevelt Road, which is named, I think, after one of the presidents or something. But there is Park, Michigan Apartments. See that great big tall building, tallest building south on the lakefront? And you know it's fancy because they spell park with a C. So as we're moving west now on Roosevelt, you'll see millions and millions of dollars in new development, all those condo towers, movie theaters, there's even a Whole Foods, look right over there. All right, we're crossing over the Dan Ryan now, and we're rolling through the University of Illinois Chicago campus. And if you look just to your left, down south there on Halsted, you can see where Maxwell Street Market used to be. But that's another tour. It's gone now anyway. And here's St. Ignatius Prep, which is where the great Mayor Daley went to school. And this is the medical district with lots of flashy hospitals and medical buildings. And over there is the Juvenile Detention Center. And just here is Douglas Park. It's a historic park. It's part of the historic boulevard system. You should bike it sometime. But we're finally getting to Pulaski and crossing over Pulaski. We're in a neighborhood called North Lawndale. And finally, here's our destination. We're almost exactly 5 miles west of the Field Museum. If you look that way, you can still see all the big buildings and everything. And as you know, Chicago is as flat as a pancake, but probably one of the flattest cities in America. You can't really believe there was actually a mountain right here at Roosevelt and Costner. Mount Henry, it was called. And here to tell the story is our tour's historian, Robin. Robin? Okay, all right. I wanted to place you on the tour bus as our tour guide today. Robin Amer is joining us today on Chicago Newsroom. Back again, been here a few times before, but now in her brand new position as host and creator of The City, now working for Gannett for USA Today, which is kind of a cool thing. You moved from The Reader when you were here, you were deputy editor of The Reader.
Yes.
But I guess Gannett decided that they needed a digital presence, and they made you the gal to do it.
Yeah, so
She's
yes.
sitting there thinking, do I answer this?
Yeah, so the new show is called The City. It's a 10-episode investigative podcast from USA Today that's been in development for the last 3 years. And as you alluded to in your opening monologue, the story is set in Chicago's North Lawndale neighborhood and tells the story of what was called in the 1990s the mountain, quote unquote. And this, of course, was not a real mountain, but a 6-story pile of construction debris that was dumped there illegally in the middle of a residential neighborhood surrounded by homes and churches and an elementary school.
Sumner.
Sumner Elementary School. And our documentary podcast, explains how this mountain of debris got there, who put it there, what systems had to fail in order for it to get as big as it did, and then all of the crazy things that happened as a result of this illegal dump being in the middle of this neighborhood.
So your goal is to tell the story of a bunch of cities, right? Not just Chicago.
Right, so we like to say that the podcast, The City, is a show about how power really works in urban America. And so our goal is eventually to go to several different cities all around the country and tell one story in each city that we visit. So the first season is set here in Chicago, where I've lived and reported for the last decade, but we do have other future seasons in development set in other cities.
You're not going to tell us what those cities are
Not
yet?
yet. No, you'll have to tune in.
We'll have to wait.
Yeah, you'll have to tune into the end of this season for that reveal.
I have to say that I think as podcasts are becoming mainstream and they're a part of our everyday lives, we're now being able to step back enough to see what they are culturally and artistically bringing to the table.
Yeah.
And what they're doing is exactly what you're doing. Being able to tell a story that I think a lot of Chicagoans probably kind of know. There was this big illegal dump and it got cleaned up, I think, or something happened out there. But to be able to go back and put it into a series of chapters, basically, it's great. And I just have really enjoyed the first 4. We've only been able to hear 4. But as we say, it's called The City, and you should check it out. You can get it wherever you get podcasts, and it is
or at thecitypodcast.com.
Or at thecitypodcast.com.
Yeah.
So let's figure out how we want to start to tell this story. I mean, my favorite is that I have to sort of like try to contain some of my enthusiasm here because I really love this series.
Thank you.
And what I love is that here it is 20, 30 years or something beyond when all this began, and you were able to find people who were there at the very beginning, like Dolores Robinson, right? I mean, here she was, she worked at Sumner.
Yes, she was a math teacher, a middle school math, 7th and 8th grade math teacher at the time, yes.
And she saw this all start to happen.
Right, so if you haven't yet heard the show, at the beginning of episode 1, we are in North Lawndale in roughly May of 1990, and we see what happens through the eyes of a few different residents there, including, as you mentioned, Dolores Robinson, who at the time was a 7th and 8th grade math teacher at Sumner Elementary School, which is at like 5th and Kildare. And her classroom looked out into a lot across the street where there had once been a tobacco factory, Copenhagen Tobacco. And
sounds like it was a pretty nasty place, too.
well, right, and so she tells the story of how when Copenhagen left Chicago for the suburbs in roughly 1973, I think, they left this abandoned factory behind, and that she had fought for years to get rid of this abandoned factory, not only because it was an eyesore, but because it was a danger to her students.
Yeah.
And they did get rid of the tobacco factory, but that meant that the land was vacant. And so in May of 1990, she looks out the window of her classroom and she sees this mysterious line of dump trucks, one by one, pulling into the lot, and each dump truck that arrives on the lot is full of concrete and asphalt and what looks like construction debris. And she watches as they just start dumping it right across the street from the school. And she's like, what is happening? Where are these trucks coming from? What is all this stuff? Why are they putting it here? It's very confusing and upsetting for her and the other people who see this transpire, and immediately it's clear to them that this is a bad situation, right? They don't know exactly who's responsible, but in a way it doesn't matter, right? It's like if you woke up one day, looked out your front window, and saw a line of dump trucks dumping literal ton after ton of construction debris across the street from your house, you wouldn't really care who was responsible for it. You would just say, no. This does not belong here. Yeah, exactly.
Something's wrong with this picture.
So that's where our story begins.
That is where the story begins. And of course, as we go through the different episodes, we learn how complex all of this is. And I think that, as I said, is the beauty of this, is that this is a multi-layered thing. So let's sort of take these facts and apply over them the grid of the Chicago political calendar.
Sure. Sure, I'm happy to do that.
1990. So Mayor Daley was not mayor yet.
No, he was.
He would have been. 89, right?
Yeah. So
89. Yeah. Okay.
So the second Mayor Daley, as we like to call him, or Baby Daley, as reporter Ben Jarafsky calls him, to distinguish him from Old Man Daley, his father. So this is Mayor Richard M. Daley, was inaugurated in April of 1989.
April 89. That's right.
And he arrived. We talk about his rise to power a little bit in the story. Because he ends up being a major player in this whole episode as a very powerful mayor. But of course, he came to power after what for Chicago was a fairly tumultuous decade, right? You had in 1983 the election of the city's first black mayor, Harold Washington, who was not just the first black mayor, but he was an independent candidate, right? He bucked the machine that had controlled Chicago for a long time. He applied the Shachtman Decree, which got rid of patronage, as he liked to say.
I went to the graveyard.
And I stomped on its grave, and it wasn't there. And you know why? Because it's dead. Yeah, so that's episode 3. And then, of course, after Harold Washington dies in office in 1987, the machine comes back into power. And so it's different than it was before. And instead of trading jobs for loyalty or jobs for votes, as the machine had done under the first Mayor Daley, you now have this alliance between city government and corporate interests. And one of the ways that expresses itself is in this host of development, these new development projects that happened all throughout the 90s and early 2000s under Mayor Daley's administration. It's almost like a renaissance for the city, meant to, as some people at the time would have put it, prevent Chicago from turning out, quote unquote, like Detroit or like Cleveland. These are obviously very problematic, somewhat racist comparisons. But this was the goal, right? To beef up the downtown, to develop the downtown. And meanwhile, no one's looking at what's happening to the other neighborhoods in the city, what they're not getting, and what they're forced to bear as a result of all of this new development.
I think it's really important. I was talking about laying the grid of Chicago, the Chicago political calendar. We would have had an election in 87, and then Harold Washington died. He was reelected and died a year later, and then Gene Sawyer comes
same year,
in.
87.
Yeah, I mean, well, yeah, Thanksgiving, yeah. And then of course Gene Sawyer comes in, and so on and so forth. But also to lay over this. Well, I don't know. There are just a number of other things that were important.
Let's take them one by one. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about North Lawndale.
Sure.
Just the neighborhood itself. This was a neighborhood that underwent probably some of the most traumatic change of any neighborhood in Chicago. But it started long before 1989, 1990.
Sure. So historically, North Lawndale, if you're talking about the sort of early to mid 20th century, had been a neighborhood full of immigrants, largely what we might call white ethnic immigrants, people from Eastern Europe. A lot of Jews lived in North Lawndale. I think it had at one point the highest concentration of synagogues in the whole city. And then starting in the 50s, the neighborhood starts to transition. And by, I think, I have to go back and look, but by I think like 1960, the neighborhood has largely transitioned from being almost entirely white and Jewish to almost entirely black. And many of the black people who are moving to North Lawndale are coming north from the south as part of the Great Migration.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this is a moment of incredible transition. And while that transition is happening, the neighborhood is also starting to deindustrialize, right?
Yeah.
So it's a neighborhood that was built before zoning. So in addition to houses and churches and schools, you have a lot of factories, very big factories, right? Western Electric, which employed something like 45,000 people, Sears and Roebuck, Zenith, Sunbeam, a lot of really iconic American brands had factories in North Lawndale. But by the time, as we put it, math teacher Dolores Robinson had been at Sumner for 2 decades. She watched as the neighborhood lost something like, I forget the numbers, but like 100,000 jobs and a third of its population, right? So the neighborhood goes through a certain kind of trauma even before our story starts, and it's that legacy of both being a segregated, almost entirely black neighborhood and a neighborhood that has gone through this deindustrialization that kind of sets the stage for the story that we tell.
In the common vernacular today, whenever you have these conversations, there's this shorthand about disinvestment in the African American community, right? This is what disinvestment looks like. 100,000 jobs just move away or disappear. I mean, in a lot of cases, just disappear. And there's nothing really to replace it. And this was happening all over Chicago, not perhaps quite as in so concentrated a way as we saw it here, but it's happening everywhere.
It's a microcosm of obviously a national story that affected not just this neighborhood and not just Chicago, but I mean, this is where we get the term the Rust Belt from, right? And cities all over the country went through that. And as a reporter, like that historical moment when our cities deindustrialize has always been really, really interesting to me. And this is a bit off topic, but I think the moment we're in now, where our cities are being rebuilt in a new kind of way, or organized around a completely different kind of economy, is another big focus of my work.
Yeah, and an important one, a very important one. Again, another detour, but the Chicago Tribune did a 36-part series. I remember it well. I remember reading it. And one of the quotes that you had is from their series on what's going on in North Lawndale. What the hell is going on in Lawndale? They said, today in North Lawndale, there's no sense of community, nothing to unite them. They are caught up in the baseness of underclass living, casual sex, illegitimate children, crime and violence, antithetical to the teachings of religion, and repugnant to those who believe in God.
So just to be clear, right, so this is
that was not the Tribune editorial board writing that.
So just to be clear, this is a quote from a series that the Chicago Tribune did in the 80s called The American Millstone, and it was a whopping 36-part series about North Lawndale. And I just want to be clear that that quote is incredibly racist. It's highly offensive.
Yes,
it's
it is.
very myopic and does not accurately at all depict what North Lawndale was really like. And that was the problem, right?
That's exactly right.
That as we in the show explore the power structures in Chicago and look at all of the different institutions that failed this neighborhood and the homeowners and the teachers and the children and just the citizens of North Lawndale, the residents of North Lawndale, the media, the mostly white-controlled Chicago mainstream media is one of the institutions that failed this neighborhood and was doing so long before the mountain showed up.
So then these places become lands of opportunity for certain kinds of individuals, like people that you would describe as someone with ties to Chicago's criminal underworld, quote unquote. And you also have, I mean, my God, we could do you have done an entire show on Bill Henry, and it's this whole thing is worth it just to hear the story of Bill Henry. It really is. He was the alderman at the time,
right?
A $5,000 guy, as he was called, because that's how much he was taking.
Right. So allegedly, Bill Henry, 24th Ward alderman in North Lawndale, late 80s, first year of the 90s, was. And he, at the time, it was reported that he had, as we put it, cut the deals that helped bring in the guy who set up these illegal dumps. Later, it was revealed that he had allegedly taken bribes from this guy, and that was why he agreed to let this guy dump there. There's a lot of, how do I put it? Bill Henry's dead. We'll never know. But
died right over 92, right?
He died in 92 of lung cancer. But this seems to be what happened, and but we also explain how his larger political story illustrates where a neighborhood like North Lawndale sits in Chicago's political pecking order, because although Bill Henry, as an alderman, had a lot of power, he didn't have the kind of power that would have allowed him to get the city to take North Lawndale's problem seriously enough to clean up the dumps once it was there.
And it's interesting that he was elected, again, going back to our political grid, he was elected the same year as Harold Washington.
So 83, yes, that's correct, yes.
And re-elected the same year Harold Washington was re-elected. Of course, Harold Washington, as we've said, died months afterward. But he was able to serve out his full 4 years. So you want to talk about getting caught in the jaws of the machinery. He starts out as a faithful guy in the machine.
Right, the regular Democratic organization, as they called it.
The RDO, He starts out in this. Harold Washington gets elected, and his whole world turns topsy-turvy on the first day after he's elected.
Right.
So he's got to get in line with Harold Washington. Right.
As we put it, he made a political calculation, right? Because the support for Harold Washington in North Lawndale and among Chicago's black residents was just overwhelming. Something like 99% of people in North Lawndale voted for Harold Washington in the general election. And so Bill Henry knew that it would be political suicide for him to do anything but support Harold Washington. And yet, that was risky because he had been a loyal machine politician for his whole career. And he also knew that if you cross the machine won't necessarily take kindly to it. And so even with supporting Harold Washington, his ward did not get the kinds of social services or financial support from the city that comparable white wards would have gotten. And so we tell the story, I think what is a really telling example of a time during the Harold Washington years where Bill Henry bought a used street sweeper from the city
I love that story.
with money from his own budget to clean up his ward because the city wasn't doing it. And that is a really heartbreaking moment. Oh, excuse me. That is a really heartbreaking moment because on one hand you have this guy who's allegedly taking money, looking the other way while this illegal dumping is happening, but he's also trying to clean up the ward in ways that the city is not. He's a very complicated character.
Yes, he is. Yeah, and this may be a good time to point out that I worked for the city of Chicago for many of those years, and the narrative that I was familiar with Bill Henry was, he was just another crooked alderman, that's it. But you've managed to humanize him in a really interesting way, and we don't really have time to go into all of that, but it was...
People should just listen to episode 3 of the City podcast.
That's why you should listen to the episode, because it's just so interesting to see a guy who has just clawed his way up inside the machine and is finally getting noticed enough that maybe they're going to slate him, they're going to put him, he's going to get to be an alderman, and on the very same day, all of a sudden the rules change completely.
Yeah.
So anyway, you've created a blame list.
Well,
and he's on the list.
Right, so we should give credit here to our reporter producer Jenny Casas, who was the lead reporter on that episode and became the expert in all things Bill Henry.
Yeah.
And the blame list was Jenny's idea, and for us it's been a useful device to really look at all of the players who had a hand in letting this illegal dump get to be 6 stories high. And Bill Henry's on that list, but there's a lot of other people on that list too. And as the season progresses, we scrutinize each individual person or institution to look at how they played a role in this happening. So Bill Henry's on that list, but your old boss Henry Henderson is also on that list, a complicated character who's a dyed-in-the-wool environmentalist, sincerely wants to help the neighborhood, but responds to pressure from this black neighborhood differently than he does to pressure from a white neighborhood. Mayor Daley's on that list, right? The ultimate power broker, the buck stops with him. In episode 4, we tell the story of Miggs Field, right? This example from 2004 where he sends bulldozers to carve X's in the middle of an airport runway.
In the middle of the night?
In the middle of the night, because he just wants to get rid of the runway on the lakefront.
Right.
And reporter Ben Jarabsky makes the argument that if Daley had really wanted the dumps in North Lawndale gone, they would have been gone. And that Miggs Field is an example of the kind of power he could have wielded if he had wanted to.
So, as a way of illustrating this, you talk about the Plody dump up at Lane Tech, which comes much later, or a few years later.
1994,
yeah.
So at this point, the dumps in North Lawndale have been there for 4 years when the company Plody Construction shows up to Lane Tech High School. They're repaving the Kennedy Expressway, and they get permission from Alderman Dick Mell and Eugene Schulter to set up a construction dump next to a high school in a majority white neighborhood, and we look at what happens in that scenario too.
I would take slight issue with it being a construction dump. It really truly was a processing operation. I mean, it was an unpermitted processing operation, but they were taking stuff in and crushing it and taking the crushed material back out, right?
I'm so glad that you brought that up, Ken, because we on our team have spent a lot of time parsing this difference between what is a quote-unquote rock crushing operation and what is a quote-unquote dump. And
lots of people have tried to figure those things out.
And I have to tell you that ultimately the conclusion that we came to through our reporting is that it was sort of a meaningless distinction because the language that Plody used when it showed up at Lane Tech was really almost identical to the language that John Christopher used when he showed up in North Lawndale. And John Christopher, whose name we haven't actually said on the show so far, is the man behind the illegal dump in North Lawndale.
Oh, I thought we had. Okay.
But when
John Christopher.
Yeah, so when John Christopher shows up in North Lawndale, city inspectors go out there and they see that he has a permit to operate a rock crusher, but he doesn't have a permit to operate a dump. And the debris that he's bringing in, arguably to crush, is piling up faster than he can crush it. And his rhetoric is very much, I'm a recycler, I'm a beautifier, I'm a legitimate businessman, I'm bringing jobs to the community. And it's really the same rhetoric that the Plody Corporation used when it arrived at Lane Tech. Now, because that situation was resolved in a matter of weeks, it's really hard to say what would have happened if they'd been allowed to continue operating there. I will say that, like they were never accused of illegal dumping in the sense that they were gone before it could become as bad as it got in North Lawndale. But we found video of that operation, and when you look at the video, what you see is a 2-story pile of construction debris next to a school. So to me, it's really a distinction without a difference.
This is one of these things about it depends where your seat is, where you're seated in the grandstands, I guess, because as somebody who was at that time, I was not around for the John Christopher dump, other than the city's attempts to clean it up, and that was a legal fight that went on for years and was an awful fight. But my perspective, you draw these distinctions as being almost parallel things in 2 neighborhoods, one in a fairly destitute black neighborhood and one in a fairly upscale white neighborhood, and the one in the white neighborhood didn't last very long and got taken away. I would say a couple of things to that. First of all, Henry Henderson, the aforementioned Henry Henderson, and yes, he was my boss, and yes, I was the chief spokesman, the lead spokesman for environment issues for the city of Chicago for about 5 years, and I was there for that entire time. The Department of Environment was born in some measure because of the lessons that were learned with that horrible dump on the west side.
Absolutely.
And so the response of the Department of Environment was more like the response that you would expect, but it didn't exist 4 or 5 years earlier. So in some ways you might say they responded appropriately to a non-permitted operation that a couple of aldermen apparently just sort of gave them the wink that they could go ahead with. So there are differences, and also,
and I just want to say we do address that.
Yeah,
right?
I know you do.
In episode 4,
Yeah.
and when we spoke to Henry Henderson, who is a character that we follow throughout the series, and who we're really grateful to because he was incredibly generous and really spoke with us at length.
Sounds like he was pretty honest
over
with
several
you.
years, and he was very forthcoming. And I think that in the show we try to really understand his perspective and the actions that he tried to take, and what he told us was, I applied the lessons learned from North Lawndale, that the lawsuit they filed in North Lawndale was ineffective, right?
Yeah.
Nobody argues that that was an effective solution. And so he said, I learned that if you didn't nip this in the bud, it could get so bad that you wouldn't be able to clean it up. Now, what we also say to that, though, is that at the time that Plody happened, John Christopher had effectively disappeared. He had declared bankruptcy. He had a judgment against him. There was a court order that was supposed to make him clean it up. And then he disappears and the city can't find him. And so I would say that because those things were happening simultaneously, even if there were lessons learned being applied, they still weren't being applied to North Lawndale, that was an ongoing situation that the city could have taken a different tack with and did not.
There's another mitigating factor in this, which I don't think we're going to really be able to talk about here because you haven't even done these episodes yet. But John Christopher turns out to be somebody who nobody knew he was, right? I mean, you've alluded to it already that that he's going to show up in later episodes of the city as a federal informant. He's wearing a wire. He's working for the federal government.
Right.
So it's. I do not know, and I haven't yet heard the rest of your podcast, so I'm anxiously awaiting to find out the degree to which his involvement with the federal government affected the cleanup of the lot.
I can tell you that it had a huge effect, a huge multi-layered effect, and you will have to stay tuned to hear all about that. But yes,
it's something I've always wondered about.
It's a really significant turning point in this story.
And may I say again, thank you for doing this. Thank you for going back 20 years and looking at why this happened. And I think that I'm in 80% agreement with you about it being a tale of 2 cities, but I also think that it's also a tale of how a city can learn and grow, and that in many ways the city is better off today than it was in 1990.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, I mean, look, I understand where you're coming from in that, like, this was you were involved, like you worked for this agency that we shine a spotlight on, and so I can understand why that might feel uncomfortable, or why you might feel implicated in that. And
I don't feel uncomfortable,
Okay.
believe me, I no longer work there, and I'm not the least bit defensive about it. But I do. I'm just saying. I'm seeing this from like 15 degrees different.
Sure, and I'll just say that like, are there things that are better than they were in 1990, 1994, 1996? Absolutely. Like, there are much more robust laws on the books locally, even nationally, to help us deal with these kinds of environmental problems. But I think the thing that really drew me to this story, and the thing that really concerns me, is how much things have not changed, right? So when I first came to this story 3 years ago, I was the Southeast Side reporter for DNA Info, may it rest in peace.
Yes, may
And my focus was on environmental justice issues on the Southeast Side, and the kinds of battles that were happening in those working class, largely Latino communities were eerily similar to the battles that were happening in North Lawndale in the 1990s. You still have
communities that were dumped on.
Right, you still have today, not just in Chicago, but all over the country, communities of color that in the environmental movement you might call frontline communities, because they live right next to all of this pollution, that are literally fighting for survival. And they're having to have the same kinds of battles, they're fighting the same kinds of opposition, and the same kind of really misleading rhetoric, largely from corporate interests, and sometimes dealing with a legal system that isn't there to support them, with a medical community that doesn't come in and provide them with the information that they need, with a regulatory system that holds their ability to live and breathe in their own communities at the same place as a company's ability to make money. That has not gone away.
And you'll get no argument from me on that.
And those battles are in some ways even more relevant now, because we have a president that has decided to dismantle a lot of the regulatory structure via the EPA that had been put in place since the 1970s to try and protect communities. And so I would argue that these, this is in some ways a 20-year-old story, but it is absolutely a story of the present as well.
And generations of progress, legal progress, are being rolled back almost every minute of the day. So those things all count too. Indulge me for just a minute to just stay on this for one more second.
Sure.
It is not fair, I think, to compare Plody with this operation that was running in West Lawndale, which was not really a company. I mean, Chris John was the company that John Christopher owned, and basically he was paying off an alderman, and then he was pocketing the costs of he was running his own landfill. So truckers were coming in and paying him for the privilege of dumping illegally on this piece of city or whatever, whoever owned it, property. Nothing like that was happening up at Lane Tech. All of the material was being brought in by this company, and the argument would be that much of it was being taken off the site before it was closed by the same company. And the company is still very much around today. It's a very large company that's still doing tollway work and everything else all over the place.
Plody still exists, and
big company.
They declined to comment for the story. I mean, look, again, was the operation that John Christopher was running in North Lawndale an order of magnitude more shady and illegal? Absolutely. I mean, that's sort of the point of our story. It's why we focus on him, because not only was he profiting off the neighborhood, but as we say in the first episode, he had deep ties to Chicago's criminal underworld that we reveal in much greater detail in the episode that comes out on Monday. But again, I just have to say, when we looked at this story, what we saw was a construction debris dump next to an elementary school in a black neighborhood that was allowed to exist there for almost a decade, versus a construction debris dump that showed up in a white neighborhood next to a school that was cleaned up in a matter of weeks. And so all of the other distinctions between what kinds of companies they are, what their intentions were, to me are not as significant as the fact that you had very, very similar situations with very similar kinds of impact in very different neighborhoods, where residents took almost the same response, right? They wrote letters, they called officials, they complained, they tried to get the media involved, they protested, and the responses were strikingly different.
Most strikingly, that when they did try to hold a protest outside the Chris John dump, the police were called and the police arrested the protesters.
Right. Well, or I mean, there's so many most significantly, but to me, most significantly is that the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Daley, personally intervened in the Plody situation, told them to go packing, and said that where they put their debris was their problem, and he. To the best of our knowledge and based on our reporting, never commented publicly on the North Lawndale dumps until much later, after he was put in a situation where he had to comment on it for reasons that you'll see later in the
You do a
season.
very good job of having actors recreate the courtroom scene with John Christopher. And Judge Lester Foreman plays a huge role in this because
Right.
talk about your blame list. I mean, here's a guy who could have ordered it to be cleaned up and didn't. And okay, that's going a little far, but
Right.
he could have played a much more significant role.
Right. So the city requested what's called an injunction, which would have been an emergency order telling John Christopher to stop immediately. And twice, the judges in this case, there was a judge actually before Lester Foreman came in, but both judges on 2 different occasions, a year apart, rejected the city's request for an injunction. And that was huge in allowing the dumping to get as bad as it did. And then, even though Judge Foreman did eventually rule in the city's favor and said, yes, this is waste, yes, this is illegal, you can't keep dumping here, he then gave John Christopher 30 months, 2.5 years to clean up the dumps, which was longer than John Christopher had asked for, and longer than he had been in North Lawndale in the first place, which Judge Foreman, in his opinion, which we dramatize in the show based on transcripts from the court proceedings, says that he doesn't want to give the players involved here what he describes as a chocolate-covered aspirin, right? Something that will be sweet going down, but ultimately bitter. And by that he meant, if I say you have to clean it up in a month, I mean, great, but are you actually going to be able to do that? Is that feasible? They say no. But then, of course, even though he gives them this very lenient, generous timeline to clean up the debris, John Christopher disappears and doesn't clean up any of it.
And there are so many just enraging contradictions in that, because one of the issues comes up that John Christopher says, well, Your Honor, I only have like 20 trucks. I mean, they're just little trucks. They're not even big. It'll take me 20 years to clean. Well, but it wasn't your trucks that dumped it. It was the people who paid you from other construction companies that came in and brought them. So why don't they have to clean it up, right? Point number one.
Well, stay tuned for episode 9 is what I'm going to say to that.
And point number 2, and the one that I must have looked really pretty stupid walking along with my earphones on and yelling to no one in particular as I was walking down the street. The judge says to John Christopher, my job here is to balance the needs of the community against the needs of this private company.
Right.
This private company?
But this is what I'm saying. This is very similar to what we deal with in the present, right?
Right.
It's for whatever reason, the debate about environmental issues in America often boils down to jobs versus people's health. And I think that's a false dichotomy. It's a real trap.
Been around from the beginning.
Right.
The beginning of the environmental movement was this tension between jobs and the environment.
Well, there was a shift, right? That, I mean, without going too much into the history, it wasn't from the very beginning, but it was a very concerted response, largely from conservative political forces, to try and undermine the new regulatory framework that started to emerge in the 70s. Yeah. And it has been a very effective rhetorical device in pushing back against regulation, because who doesn't want jobs? Of course, the problem is that if you have companies that are literally poisoning people, and I think here about the uncovered piles of manganese in the southeast side, which is a neurotoxin, it's a false equivalency.
Yeah. But nevertheless, the idea that there's that old saw in legal circles that the guy who killed his parents and then begged for leniency from the judge because he was an orphan, and there's a kind of a similar strain here. It's sort of like, oh, Judge, I couldn't possibly clean this up. I just don't have the resources to clean this up.
Right.
Oh, well then.
And he would maintain that story. I mean, without giving too much away, like he would continue to insist that had the city not stopped him from dumping, he would have had the money to clean up the dumps, which of course I think is
nonsense.
Yeah.
So it's the city, and it is playing now in a pair of earbuds near you.
Right. So if you go to thecitypodcast.com and hit subscribe, you can see links to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever you listen.
Good. You know, again, you're dealing on so many levels here. You're dealing with the sort of the macro issue of the politics and the disinvestment and the economy and everything else. But you tell the story by finding really great people who tell their incredible stories. And I was just so taken with the guy, I don't think I wrote his name down, but who was a kid.
This is Dacey Nichols is
that's
his name.
Right, yeah. Who played on this thing, and for him and his compatriots, this was their Chicago Public Park. This was a great place to hang out. And I got to tell you, as somebody who kind of grew up in alleys myself, there was a little bit of me that was kind of almost envious in a way, like what a cool place to.
Well,
to
but
hang
of
out.
course, yeah. I mean, I hear you, but so Dacey Nichols was a child when the dumps emerged. He was a student at Sumner Elementary School. He has a lot of really fond memories of playing in this illegal construction debris dump, but of course he tells the story of how his brother almost lost a finger after a chunk of concrete rolls down the mountain and severs his brother's finger. I mean, these were very, we're talking about children here, these were vulnerable children who were exposed to a very dangerous situation as a result of this dumping.
And there's the image too of these kids who will climb to the top of the mountain and they'll look east and they'll be able to see downtown, which they might not have spent a lot of time in.
I can't speak to that. I don't know.
But I mean, I can say that I know that that's certainly true for a lot of young people in Chicago, that they really don't spend time outside of their community, and it's just a heartbreaking story. It really is, and
we'll hear more from Dacey later in the season.
Oh, good! I want to hear more from him.
He's a really great guy.
And I think that this story is essentially over now, isn't it? No.
You haven't heard the end of the show, Ken.
No, I haven't.
All I can say
does it leave questions hanging in the air at the end?
We try not to. Yeah. I mean, what I will say is that by the end of the season, we will have brought this story into the present, and we will be talking about North Lawndale in the present and providing some answers to questions that residents really asked us to try and get answers to. And so we try our best through our reporting in episode 10 to provide the neighborhood with some answers that they have never gotten from the city.
It's a curiosity to me because the alderman today is the son of one of the most powerful people in Daley's administration, Michael Scott Sr. and Jr. The senior was, he was a big deal in the Daley administration, held several major posts. So I can only assume that Michael Scott knows a little bit more about the wheels of power than
I will say
than
stay
others
tuned
might.
for episode 10.
I keep trying, I forget it. Robin, it's a pleasure having you here.
Thank
Thanks.
you so much,
And I
Ken.
hope you'll come back
Appreciate it.
again, because
Always.
there's always a million things to talk about, okay?
Happy to.
Right.
Thank you.
Robin Amer is the host and creator of the podcast The City, and you can get it wherever podcasts are sold or from...
For free. It's free.
Oh, I thought you were going to plug your...
You can subscribe via Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. You can also find it on our website, which is thecitypodcast.com.
There you go. And we thank Robin for being here today, and you can also subscribe to our podcast. We have one too, but it's just a bunch of old Chicago Newsroom shows. I don't know if that's as exciting. However, you can see all of our past shows by going to this address right here, and we hope you'll do that. And I'm not going to be here next week. Kitty Kurth is going to be taking over next week for a very interesting conversation about politics of the day and the mayoral thing and all that. So watch us next week, okay? All right, thanks. See you next week. Bye-bye.